Today, we're talking about the key compositional elements of a time-lapse and the technical both in-field and at home in the post-processing. So what makes a good time-lapse? Well, for me, it's a strong composition that showcases the passage of time on different levels. So for instance, you might have people walking in the foreground or cars driving at a different speed. You might have clouds in the sky that are moving quickly or slowly. It's kind of nice to just have different layers of interesting things to look at and see that passage of time. What's the technique behind shooting a time-lapse? Well, my first tip for you is if you've never shot a time-lapse and you haven't really used a professional camera too much, use the camera that's in your pocket. These days, smartphones have automatic time-lapse functions in them. Just swipe over to the time-lapse option, set it up in a sturdy place, and let it go. If you want to take it to the next level, use a camera with dedicated settings and a larger sensor, something like this. By using a camera with manual settings, you get just a little bit more control over all of the individual aspects of the time-lapse. One quick tip for you too is shoot your time-lapses in a really boring place the first couple times you try doing this, especially day to night time-lapses. See if you can get your settings right before you go to somewhere super beautiful where you only get one shot at it. Now onto the specific settings of the time-lapse. Might come as a surprise, but I've been shooting mine on program auto for many years now. Especially with the Sony cameras, I found that the metering is excellent and the camera does a great job of ramping the exposure in different brightnesses, especially from day to night. The only time I shoot in either aperture priority or shutter priority is when I want a specific effect with the shutter speed, or I want to make sure that the aperture just starts at a wide open setting. But generally, program auto does the trick for me these days. Once you're in program auto, make sure that your files are saving as RAW, and some cameras even have a lossless compressed RAW format that saves a lot of storage space without losing any of the quality, so check if your camera has that. As for storage capacity, it really depends on how long your time lapse is going to be. I have two 128GB cards and they're set to start writing to the second slot as soon as the first one fills up. I've never run out of storage with that, and I think I get about 3,000 images that way. Next, on Sony cameras, there's a setting called ISO Auto Minimum Shutter Speed, and I think other camera brands must have settings like this, but I've never tried. Basically what this setting does is it tells the camera what the maximum length shutter speed is that you're allowed before switching over to ISO to get your exposure correct. So for instance, if you're shooting in the pitch dark and you tell it to max out at 15 seconds, it won't go any longer than 15 seconds so that you can avoid getting star trails or whatever it is your goal is there. The biggest thing you have to decide with this setting is whether or not you want star trails in your image, and if you want to even do a star trails time lapse. If you do want to do a star trails time lapse, make sure that your interval has as little gap between shots as possible. So for instance, set your interval to anything lower than what your maximum shutter speed will be. With 15 seconds, you would want something under 15 seconds, like a 10-second interval or something like that. And most newer cameras have no problem continuously shooting images, even if the interval is shorter than what the actual exposures are. Once you've figured out the exposure ramping settings correctly, you just want to set your focus manually so that it's not shifting throughout the time lapse. If you're planning to shoot late into the night and you'll get stars in your time lapse and you want to make sure that they're in focus, but it's the middle of the day when you're starting, just focus for the longest point away from you. Just try to find an object super far away from you and focus on that, and leave your manual focus on that, and that should be plenty for the time lapse. Another issue that I've encountered is having the immediate foreground in focus when I'm trying to focus on my hyperfocal distance that I mentioned earlier so that the stars are in focus later. And one way that I've kind of overcome this is by using aperture priority and starting out at a really closed down aperture at the beginning of my time lapse so that I have a larger depth of field and more of that foreground is in focus. And then as the night progresses, I've slowly opened up my aperture so that just the sky is in focus and the distant objects, and I'm not too worried about that immediate foreground when it's the dead of night and you can't really see much in the foreground anyway. Once you have your exposure and your focus dialed, don't forget to set up your intervalometer. I've made this mistake too many times, and actually even just last week I was in Death Valley and I forgot to turn my intervalometer on, and I woke up to just one picture because my intervalometer wasn't on, so I just didn't even notice. In terms of the interval that you use, just do some quick math and see how many shots you want. If you kind of have a ballpark of how long you're going to be shooting for, you can figure out how many shots you'll have. If it's a shorter time lapse, you might want to set a shorter interval so that you have more frames to work with and your time lapse can last longer. So for instance, something like 7 seconds might be fine for a 2 to 3 hour time lapse. But if you're doing a 12-hour time lapse, you might want to consider doing something like 15 or 25 seconds as your interval. Otherwise, your camera is just going to be super full with images and processing it is going to be a huge pain in the butt. Lastly, a couple tips for battery life. I tend to shut off my rear LCD. There's a button you can map on Sony to do that as a way to just save a little bit of battery. I also like to turn airplane mode on my camera so that the Wi-Fi is turned off and it's not constantly streaming. Lastly, use a power bank to power your camera for the whole night, and make sure trickle charging is turned on if it has that. Now let's get into the editing. You're gonna need 3 pieces of software: Lightroom Classic, LR Timelapse, which you can download a free trial of. I'll leave the link down below. And lastly, you'll need a video editing software of your choosing. I'm going to use Adobe After Effects for this tutorial, but you can use really whatever. The first step in LR Timelapse is we're going to add keyframes. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what a keyframe is, it's basically just a starting or an ending point for a transition. In this case, it's going to be starting or ending any of the settings that we want to change in Lightroom Classic. That's one of the things that makes LR Timelapse so powerful, is you can change literally any of those sliders in Lightroom. You can even use gradients, stuff like that. And you can set keyframes throughout your sequence so that they gradually change over time. To start this process, you can click on the keyframes wizard button and select how many keyframes you'd like throughout the sequence. One tip that I'll give you is if things are not really changing much in terms of lighting, you don't really need to have a bunch of keyframes throughout your sequence in that part. So you can scroll over to the part of the sequence where those keyframes are at and simply uncheck them to remove them from your sequence. You can also add keyframes in certain places where the lighting might be changing a lot. So for me, it's going to be during sunrise or sunset. Once you've got all your keyframes set up, you can hit the save button, and all those keyframes will be saved to the metadata on those files, and then we can swap over to Lightroom. Now in Lightroom Classic, I'm going to hit the G button to see the gallery view in the library here, and hit Control A and read the metadata from the files. What this is going to do is it's going to pick up all those keyframes that we set in LR Timelapse, and it's going to indicate them using 4 stars. In order to just see the keyframes, we have to head over to the filter and select LRT keyframes. From here, I'm just going to go and edit each keyframe the way I want it to look. The only thing you want to make sure to do here is after each keyframe's edited, head over to the scripts tab and use the LR Timelapse sync keyframe script to sync all the settings between the keyframe you're on and the ones after it in the sequence. So you just have to make sure you're selecting all of the keyframes afterwards and hitting that sync button. Also make sure you deselect all the keyframes before the one you're working on, just so you don't mess up any of those settings. Once you're done editing your keyframes, just head back to the full sequence and save your metadata to your files so that we can go back to LR Timelapse. Now I'm back in LR Timelapse. I'm just going to hit the auto transition button. And what that's going to do is calculate all the luminance values between the different keyframes and try to figure out how to smooth them out between the different keyframes in your sequence. Once LR Timelapse has gone through and analyzed every image in your sequence, you can click this visual deflicker button and it'll give you this green line, which is sort of your ideal luminance curve. Then for accuracy, I typically leave it on default. I do use multi-pass deflicker, and usually 2 to 4 passes is the most that I need to get it right. You can refine this as many times as you want to, so if you're really having a lot of trouble, giving your computer a couple extra passes through the sequence might help make it a lot smoother. One last little tip is if you have a road in your foreground or something where a lot of bright flashes happen throughout your sequence, you may want to use this feature where you click on the little square here and you draw a rectangle around the part of the scene that you want it to do its metering from. Once you're ready to go, hit apply and then step away for a while because this might be a long process. Now I just need to go back to Lightroom Classic, read the metadata from the files, and hit export on this time lapse. Okay, it is much later. As you can see, there's an artificial light turned on now. That's how late it got. All I have to do to convert my sequence into a video is import the footage to After Effects and then export it as a video. So I'm just gonna click on New Composition from Footage, find the folder with the time lapse in it, click on the first one, make sure importer JPEG sequence is selected, and now I have a sequence with my time lapse here. You can go into the composition settings and change the width and height to 3840 by 2160 if you want a 4K time lapse, and then just go ahead and rescale your time lapse to fit into the 16:9 aspect ratio and reposition it however you want. This is also your opportunity to add motion keyframes into your time lapse, especially if you shot a static time lapse. You can add a subtle zoom in there. You can add a pan up or down since you have extra pixels to work with here. It's up to you however you want to put the focus on movement in your video. Comment down below if you'd be interested in a separate video on how to do star trail time lapses, or even mixing star trails with a regular time lapse to have them fade in or fade out at a certain point in the time lapse. Just let me know down in the comments if that's something that would interest you. Here's the final result of the video. If you found it useful, give me a thumbs up and make sure to hit the subscribe button to see future tutorials. Until next time.